Bosworth Summit Pound, a ghost story by L.T.C. Rolt. Adapted and read by Rhys B. Davies. Henry Fawcett was a friend of mine, and one of those men who, to borrow a popular phrase, loved messing about in boats. Being a man of independent means with no domestic ties, he was a happy and confirmed bachelor. He was able to spend his long lifetime indulging that passion to its fullest. Although I accompanied him on several occasions, I had no idea as to the true extent of his voyaging, until after his death, when there came into my possession a collection of handwritten manuscripts filled with Henry's characteristic cramped handwriting. These were his logbooks, in which he had kept a complete and meticulous record of his travels, and from reading them it appeared that there were few harbours in the Mediterranean along the northwestern seaboard of Europe with which Henry Fawcett was not familiar. As you can imagine, these logs contained many amazing tales, and I found myself eagerly reading entry after entry, encountering anecdotes that could each have been made into its own story, and farcical antics that could outdo even the comic genius of Woodhouse. Other entries, however, described true adventures and genuine peril. Henry had, in his time at sea, been run aground and near shipwrecked on several occasions, and in one noteworthy account had braved storm-force winds to rescue the crew of a stricken tramp steamer. Some of these exploits read as harrowing, so much so that many a sailor less intrepid than Henry Fawcett might have been forgiven in quitting the seas for solid land. There is thus something oddly ironic, and certainly tragic, that a man who could single-handedly ride out a gale in the Bay of Biscay should be scared almost out of his wits in the heart of the English Midlands, on the narrow, landlocked waters of the Great Central Canal, at Bosworth. Very few people are familiar nowadays with the Great Central Canal, and even fewer remember its little-used North Midland section. It is in fact all but forgotten except by those infrequent boatmen who still navigate its narrow and tortuous course, and of course by the lock keepers in their lonely cottages beside the locks at Cold Bosworth and Cannon's Hanger. Despite this, many have passed over the route of the canal, perhaps briefly catching a glimpse of its still and reed-fringed waters before they hurry along north along those great road and rail routes which stride so arrogantly across the Midland Shires. Yet it is rare that a passing traveller feels sufficiently interested to ask of this little-used water road. Why was it built, and where does it lead? Likewise, perhaps only antiquaries and collectors of village churches are familiar with St. Peter's, parish church of Cold Bosworth. To the parishioners, of course, it is a prominent local landmark, and its splendid broach spire has stood foursquare to the winds of the wolds since medieval times. And like all small and forgotten village churches, St. Peter's has gained its secrets down the centuries. Perhaps the most surprising of these secrets is one that is comparatively modern, for when curious visitors stand in the nave of St. Peter's to admire the remarkable 14th century rood screen, or the delicate tracery of the chancery windows, little do they realise that the waters of the Great Central Canal lie directly beneath their feet. As a glance at any contoured map will show, St. Peter's stands upon England's central watershed, that great belt of hard Jurassic limestone that extends from the coast of Dorset all the way to the North Yorkshire moors. Thus, when rainwater falls from the roof of St. Peter's, local streams carry it away in all directions, flowing through the rivers Trent, Nene and Avon towards the Humber, the Wash and the Bristol Channel. The erosion from all this hydrological activity has narrowed the ridge at this point considerably. Consequently, it was here at Cold Bosworth where the canal's engineers decided to cut the watershed by driving a formidable tunnel through the ridge, one that is little over a mile long and which runs directly beneath both church and village. Now, a section of canal between two locks is known as a pound or a level, and that part of the Great Central that incorporates Bosworth Tunnel also happens to be the summit of the canal. Just above the lock called Bosworth Top, and within a few hundred yards of St. Peter's churchyard wall, the summit level disappears underground. But as both the lock and the tunnel portal are hidden in the thick undergrowth of Bosworth Wood, a stranger standing in the churchyard would be unaware of their existence. But before he leaves the precincts of St. Peter's, I would draw such a stranger's attention to another curious feature. This is a tombstone, one that stands on the north side of the churchyard, and if not one of St. Peter's secrets, it's certainly one of its mysteries. The stone itself is of no particular merit, and at first glance it bears no inscription that might catch the eye of a collector of curious epitaphs. It may therefore easily escape notice, but upon appreciation it can be seen that the inscription, although simple, is somewhat singular. It reads, "Here lies the body of Mary Grimsden, of Canon's Hanger in this parish, aged 25 years. Here lies also the body of John Fortescue Lofthouse, of Coppice Farm, Cold Bosworth. Died February 14th, 1841, aged 31 years. In death they were not divided." Now, the fact that the date of Mary Grimsden's death is not given might conceivably be due to an error on the part of the village mason. But it's surely strange that two ostensibly unrelated persons should not only be buried in a common grave, but also accorded an epitaph usually reserved for those who've enjoyed many years of wedded bliss. I must confess that although a frequent visitor to the churchyard, I never noticed this gravestone myself. That is, until my attention was drawn to it by Fawcett's story. It all happened in 1932, on what was fated to be Henry Fawcett's last voyage. In the autumn of 28, he'd returned to England a sick man. Poor Henry lay in hospital all that winter, and when at last he was able to get about again, he realised bitterly that his seagoing days were over. But he would not leave his beloved boats. As he put it, "If I can't have salt water, I'll have to stick to fresh." Sure enough, he quickly sold his yawl Deirdre and brought one of those long, narrow canal boats, which he proceeded to convert into a really quite comfortable motor-driven houseboat. Wildflower, he called her, and with one hand on her tiller and the other cupping his pipe, he spent a happy 2 years exploring Britain's inland waterways. Narrowboats such as Wildflower are popular nowadays with holidaymakers, but Henry was one of the first to live on the canal solely for the pleasure of it, and I joined him on several pleasant excursions: the Shropshire Union, the Llangollen, and the Peak Forest. The last time I saw him was during the winter of 1931, when he had a snug berth on the Trent and Mersey Canal. He then seemed in good health and even better spirits, and told me of his intention to take Wildflower south in the spring. I had no further news of him until the following June, when I heard with some surprise that Wildflower was up for sale. A week or so afterwards, I read in the Times the announcement of Henry's death.
those who trespass against us, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
Because he recorded his last voyage in his usual scrupulous manner, and thanks to my intimate knowledge of that district, it's been easy for me to reconstruct the story of Henry's experience at Col Bosworth. He was accompanied by a friend unknown to me who is referred to in the log as Charles. The journey from the Trent and Mersey to the Great Central Canal was accomplished in good weather and without any untoward incident, and a fine May morning found them beginning the long climb up the flight of locks at Cannon's Hanger towards the summit level at Col Bosworth. Now Charles, it seems, had to return to London for a couple of days on business, so it was agreed that when they reached a convenient point to moor up, Henry would await his return. Now, because it's connected by a branch line to Rugby, Col Bosworth was selected. Henry duly consulted the lock-keeper at Cannon's Hanger as to convenient mooring, and was advised to tie up below the top lock at Bosworth. By midday they had reached the summit, and here they paused for lunch before entering the tunnel. Now, in my opinion, navigating a boat through a canal tunnel is always a strange and unsettling experience. Henry, by contrast, always seemed to take them in his stride, yet he seems to have found his passage through Bosworth Tunnel to have been singularly unpleasant. Not only was the narrow cavern of brickwork as dark and cold as a vault, especially by contrast to the warmth and brilliance of the May sunshine, but water streamed from the roof and poured from the chimneys of the ventilation shafts, cascading in waterfalls over Wildflower's roof and deck, forcing Henry to don his waterproofs. From the log he seems to have had the utmost difficulty in keeping a straight course, and describes the damp atmosphere as exhaling an evil-smelling mist which obscured the far end of the tunnel and rendered the headlight on Wildflower's bow ineffective. All Henry could see ahead was a lambent white curtain, patterned confusingly with shifting shadows. At one moment, he thought he saw Charles leaning dangerously over the gunwale at the bow and called out, fearing his friend would strike his head against the tunnel wall. But Charles immediately answered from the aft cabin close at hand, and the shadow presently vanished. At length, a wan disk of daylight appeared ahead, and they presently emerged from the mists into the bright sunlight of the short pound between the tunnel mouth and Bosworth top lock. From experience, I can describe the canal here as being well sheltered by the slopes of Bosworth Wood. On one bank the trees grow right down to the water's edge, but on the other side the old towpath creates a narrow border of smooth green turf. It looks like an ideal mooring, and Henry wondered why the lock-keeper at Cannon's Hanger should have advised them to tie up below the top lock. Not only did this appear less inviting, but it was further from the village. This recommendation seemed even less explicable when, Henry having brought Wildflower alongside the bank, Charles jumped ashore and discovered rusty mooring rings buried beneath the turf. In Henry's mind this settled the matter, and instead of proceeding on towards Bosworth Lock, he and Charles set about securing Wildflower to the bank, nestled under the lee of the trees, with the mouth of the tunnel almost right at her stern. Obviously it was here that, in the old days of horse-drawn traffic, the horses were detached and led over the hill, while the boatmen manually took the boats through the tunnel by the laborious practice of legging. This involves lying on boards laid across the deck and pressing one's feet against the walls to propel the boat through the tunnel. The coming of steam and fuel oil engines rendered it obsolete, and I'm quite sure the boatmen were glad to see it go, but I suspect the horses might have had some complaint, for mechanical power also laid them out to pasture. Nowadays, the horse path at Bosworth Tunnel has become a little-used footway climbing up the wooded slope towards the village, in places almost blinded by the thick undergrowth of briar and hazel. It was up this path that Charles set forth half an hour later, just in time to catch the afternoon train from that sleepy station that is called Cold Bosworth and Marlborough Road, one of many such delightful country stations that Dr. Beeching currently has designs upon. Charles's train departed on time, and continuing its journey west from Market Marlborough to Rugby, swept around Cold Bosworth village to cross the canal just below the Bosworth locks. Having walked down to the locks to confirm he'd made the right choice in mooring up near the tunnel, Henry caught a glimpse of a hand waving him farewell from the window of a second-class compartment, and happily returned the gesture with a wave of his own. Then the train continued on its way, taking Charles with it, and Henry, now alone, made his way back to Wildflower, returning past the locks towards the summit and the sunlit cutting that led to the tunnel. Henry was too well accustomed to his own company to feel lonely or at a loss after the departure of his friend. Once he'd brewed himself a pot of tea, he filled his pipe, got out his rod, and sat out on Wildflower's deck, happily fishing. He didn't catch anything, but he was well content, for the contemplation of his motionless float was little more than an excuse to enjoy a lovely evening. The smoke of his pipe made a thin blue column in the windless air. The setting sun threw golden, moted rays between trees that were resplendent with new leaf, and the wood was loud with birdsong. Yet when the sun left the wood and the shadows began to gather around the mouth of the tunnel, it grew quite chilly, and he went below. He cooked himself a liberal supper, wrote up his log for the day, and then, with a contented sigh, turned into his comfortable bunk. But for some reason he was denied his customary sound sleep. After a fitful doze during which he tossed and turned uneasily, he suddenly awoke to full consciousness, and the dawn was already breaking before he slept again. Two distracting sounds seemed to have contributed to this wakefulness. One was a soft recurrent thudding, as though some object floating in the water occasionally nudged the hull of the boat. The other was a faint and desolate wailing, rising and falling in mournful irregular cadence, and sounding now close about the boat and now infinitely far off. It seemed to come from the direction of the tunnel, and Henry concluded that it must be some trick of the wind blowing over the top of one of the ventilation shafts, although through his cabin window he could see a pattern of branches in motionless silhouette against the moonlight. With the aid of a boat hook he might, he reflected, dispose of one of these disturbances, yet for some reason he did not feel inclined to leave his bed. He excused himself upon the grounds that the night seemed to be remarkably cold for the time of year. The following day appears to have passed uneventfully. After his uncomfortable night, Henry slept late, and consequently it was nearly noon when, breakfast disposed of, he set off for Cold Bosworth to replenish his stores at the village shop. On his return, he spent the rest of another glorious afternoon happily engaged on the countless small jobs which can always be found on a boat. Charles was due to return the following morning, and this was a good opportunity to get everything shipshape before they continued their journey. Another task Henry set himself was to inquire at Bosworth locks as to when in the morning it would be convenient to work Wildflower down the flight. When he duly presented himself at the cottage tucked in alongside the bottom lock, he found that the resident lockkeeper, Tom Oakey, had been taken ill some days previously. The locks were instead being overseen by a pleasant enough lad from Market Marlborough, who, not being from the area, could give no answers when Henry asked why the mooring outside the tunnel went unused. By the time I made my own visit to Bosworth, Tom Oakey was back at work and extremely talkative on the subject of the Summit Pound, and I sometimes wonder if Henry's story might have ended differently, if old Tom had been present to share with him some of the local boatman's wisdom. His various tasks completed, Henry decided to allow himself an evening excursion into Cold Bosworth to explore the vicinity somewhat, and following a footpath up from the locks beside the railway, he duly entered into the village from the north along Station Road. He spent a pleasant few hours in the narrow-boat inn, but once again his curiosity on the matter of the summit moorage was stymied, for in spite of that establishment's name, none of the regulars worked the canal. Eventually he put the subject out of his mind, and instead treated himself to a fine meal and a friendly few rounds of bowls, all of this being washed down by the excellent local stout. When he did eventually return to Wildflower, the sun was setting quickly, and the shadows were growing thick around Bosworth Woods, as he followed the old horse path down to the canal. Now, in exiting the village, this follows the wall of St. Peter's churchyard, and thus Henry unknowingly passed within just a few yards of that curiously inscribed tombstone. By the time Henry arrived back at the Summit Pound, night was approaching, and being well fed and consequently sleepy, he decided now was as good a time as any to call it a day. Tomorrow there could be no lying late abed, and so Henry turned in early, and almost immediately fell into a deep sleep. Whether or not what followed was a dream, I leave for you to judge. Henry suddenly found himself standing on the stern of Wildflower and peering into the mouth of Bosworth Tunnel. He had no idea why he was doing so or what he expected to see, for though the moon was bright, the blackness of that tunnel was impenetrable. The night was calm and beautiful, and the trees cast dark arabesques of leaf and branch on the waters of the canal, which were moon-silvered and mirror-bright with quiet, still perfection. Yet somehow the whole scene seemed to have become charged with that sense of imminent terror which is the potent and horrifying prelude of nightmare. Still, Henry continued to stare wide-eyed into the blackness, seeing nothing and hearing nothing, only the hollow echoing plash of water dripping from the tunnel roof. Then, at length, he perceived a thickening of the shadows beneath the curving abutment wall, and presently saw a figure, more shade than substance, move down the towpath to crouch and stare from the bank into the still water. It moved in near total silence, and only the face showed pale in the moonlight. For a time the figure seemed to grope beside the water, and Henry knew, without knowing why he knew, that his silent visitor sought for something which it feared to find. Then, with a swift movement which suggested it had been startled by some sound inaudible to Henry, the figure rose and turned to peer intently into the tunnel. It was at this moment that the feeling of ominous dread, which all this time had been gathering power and force like a thundercloud in Henry's mind, suddenly assumed a real and hideous shape. something rose out of the water. Something monstrous, yet which possessed the semblance of human shape. Mercifully, it could not be clearly seen. The face, if face there was, seemed to be hidden by dark hair as by a veil, but the phosphorescence of rot and corruption dimly suggested a figure that was naked. The dark watcher on the bank, with a gesture of despair, made to turn away and flee, but stumbled. Seeing its chance, his fearful antagonist fell upon him with such live and intent purpose that the issue and the goal of this brief and horrific encounter was never in doubt. Inexorably, the nightmarish attacker slid back into the canal, dragging its terrified prey with it. A splash, a cry, a desperate flailing hand, and then the waters closed over them both, as terminal and as final as a grave. Now, long before this, Henry should have awakened with a shout to find himself trembling and sweating in his bed. But he maintains in the log that there was no awakening, that his fear gradually ebbed away until he realised that he was, in truth, shivering in his pyjamas on the aft deck of the Wildflower, his fingers clenched so tight round the tiller that the knuckles gleamed white in the moonlight. I have little doubt that the physical and mental rigours of this experience were at least partly responsible for poor Henry's early death, for there is no further entry in the log, and I conjecture that it was his friend Charles who took Wildflower on to Horton Junction, where she lay until she was sold. Now, my personal recollections of Henry Fawcett convinced me that he had experienced something at Bosworth more than just a nightmare, albeit a nightmare accompanied by a risky feat of sleepwalking. It was this conviction which took me to Cold Bosworth. Now, I'm not going to weary or bother you with all the details of my search, which took me from the lock-keeper at Cannon's Hanger through the dusty files of the Marlborough Messenger to the tomb in the churchyard, which I've already referred. Instead, I'll keep this as brief and to the point as I can. The lockkeeper at Cannon's Hanger proved to be uncommunicative and sceptical, though he admitted that the summit level was said by the boatmen to be disturbed, and on this account they would never tie up there. Old Tom Oakey at Bosworth Locks, however, was far more loquacious. "They do say," he vouchsafed, "that the summit be troubled by a chap what drowned himself there a long time back." It was this observation which was really the starting point of my research. The story I've pieced together begins not with the chap what drowned himself, to quote old Tom, but with someone I've mentioned already, someone whose name you may recall, one Mary Grimsden. Young Mary lived with her widowed mother in a small cottage. It was pulled down many years ago, but I've been able to establish it stood on common land just outside of Cold Bosworth on the fringe of Cannon's Hanger Woods. The Grimsdens appear to have been of gypsy stock, and Rebecca, Mary's mother, is described as a herbalist. From this and other references, I gather that she must have been a formidable old woman, who, had she lived in an earlier period, might well have suffered death as a witch. It seems that Mary took after her mother, and this is where John Lofthouse enters the story. John was the heir to Coppice Farm, and despite the general prejudice of the era and the poor reputation the Grimsdens had in the area, seems to have fallen for Mary's good looks and striking personality. This unfortunately did not go unnoticed. The Lofthouses were substantial yeoman farmers who had held Coppice Farm for generations, so you can understand why their son's infatuation with a cottager of dubious ancestry and even more dubious occupation soon set tongues a-wagging, especially in a period when class and social hierarchy were ground into the very fabric of country life. Eventually, almost inevitably, news of the affair reached the ears of the Lofthouses, and John undertook to see Mary no more. Whether he was pressured to see the folly of his ways or chose to discard Mary of his own accord is unknown. Yet this did not put an end to things, for rumours grew that Mary was with child by young John, and that she intended by this means to retaliate against her faithless lover and his family. I personally feel that they deserved some shaming. But the good family of Lofthouse were spared from such embarrassment by an unforeseen and surprising stroke of luck. At dusk on a fine August evening in 1840, Mary Grimston walked out of the little cottage at Cannon's Hanger and never returned. Despite a most extensive search, no trace of her could be found, and though he had forsworn her, it was remarked that John Lofthouse appeared to be deeply affected by Mary's disappearance. Though old Rebecca Grimston insisted that her daughter had been the victim of foul play, the village seems to have come to the callous conclusion that Mary's gypsy blood had gotten the better of her, and that she'd run away on some adventurous whim. Hardly had the talk of this affair died down when local gossip found fresh and startling fuel in the disappearance of John Lofthouse. This happened in February of the following year, specifically on the night of February the 14th. But this time the mystery was soon solved, for a local boatman stepped forward with some compelling testimony. By chance, he had delivered a load of lime to Coppice Farm late on the night in question, and while working his boat down the Bosworth locks, he claimed to have seen on the towpath the figure of young Mr. John, walking swiftly and alone in the direction of the tunnel. Acting upon the strength of this evidence, the decision was taken to drag the canal, starting at the western portal of the tunnel, and this led almost immediately to a discovery of a most shocking nature. Not only was the body of John Lofthouse recovered, but entangled with it in the grappling irons was another. Because the latter had been long dead, it was unrecognisable, nor was it possible to determine the cause of death. Death in such a form is never pleasant to behold, but this watery exhumation seems to have had a singularly disturbing effect on those present. Though the canal had been dragged without result at the time of Mary's disappearance, Rebecca Grimston identified a ring recovered with the second body as having belonged to her daughter. Had it not subsequently been confirmed by other, more reliable witnesses, it is doubtful if this evidence of identification would have been admissible, for to judge from her conduct at the resulting inquest, the old woman was quite out of her mind. Inquests of death are usually grim enough, but on reading contemporary accounts I'm struck with a peculiar quality of the macabre in this instance. In the first place, when ordered to view the bodies of the deceased, the jury was so affected that proceedings had to be suspended for a time. When the hearing was eventually resumed, Rebecca Grimston's interruptions made matters worse, for she seemed to be labouring under the ghastly illusion that she was attending her daughter's wedding. Together with other singular observations which are not recorded, and I'm somewhat glad, Rebecca kept reiterating that she had fulfilled her promise to provide her daughter with a bridegroom, an assertion which proved so disquieting that the coroner was compelled to order her removed from court. Despite evidence that John Lofthouse had become increasingly morose since Mary Grimston's disappearance, an open verdict was returned in both cases, perhaps in deference to the feelings of the young man's family. Yet why that family should have consented to the burial of their son in a common grave with a gypsy girl, and why they caused to be erected over it so curious a tombstone, is not explained. I have formed my own conclusions which I prefer not to discuss. We'll probably never know what really happened on that sultry August night so long ago, the night when Mary Grimston disappeared. But I will mention in conclusion a discovery of my own which I consider significant. I was exploring the wood which gives Coppice Farm its name when I came across a circular wall of old brickwork, and upon investigation found that it protected the mouth of one of the ventilation shafts for Bosworth Tunnel. The wall was not so high that an active man might not thereby rid himself of a heavy and unwelcome burden by dumping it down the shaft, and as I leant over the parapet I could hear, as if from a well, the drip of water far below. I returned to my lodgings that winter evening along the towpath, and in the gathering dusk passed the spot where Henry had moored up Wildflower, just west of the tunnel. The water of the canal looked black and was very still under the shadows of the trees. I'm not a credulous man, but I've got to admit that I did not feel inclined to stop and look round. Instead, I hurried on, keeping as far as possible from the water's edge, and I must confess to feeling profoundly relieved when I descended past the top lock and reached the safety of the moorings below the Summit Pound and the tunnel.